It was the winter of 1944, and the entire MGM crew had gone completely silent, cameras, directors, executives, all of them, because a 12-year-old Elizabeth Taylor had just walked off her mark, crossed the soundstage, and crouched down to whisper something into the ear of a 9-year-old boy that nobody else could hear. What happened to that boy's face in the next 60 seconds would be talked about by everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. And what Elizabeth had whispered, the thing she somehow knew at 12 years old that no adult on that set had figured out, would explain everything about who she became. If this kind of story is what you come here for, the real Hollywood, the moments that never made it into the press releases, then make sure you are subscribed, because this channel exists for exactly this. Hit the bell. You will not want to miss what comes next. MGM's Stage 27 in the winter of 1944 was not a warm place, despite the arc lights burning at full intensity from before dawn until well after dark. The production of National Velvet had been running for weeks by that point, and the crew had settled into the particular rhythm that long shoots develop, a kind of institutional muscle memory where everyone knows their position, their timing, their role in the enormous machinery of a major studio picture. Clarence Brown directed with the precise authority of a man who had been making films at MGM for 2 decades, who had worked with Greta Garbo and Clark Gable and understood exactly how the studio system functioned, which meant he also understood how to keep a production moving forward regardless of what happened around him. Budgets were sacred, schedules were law, wasted time on an MGM stage was not an abstraction, it was a number, and that number was always very large, and Louis B. Mayer always knew what it was. Elizabeth Taylor had already been a professional for 4 years by the time National Velvet went into production. She had made her first film at Universal in 1942, appeared in Lassie Come Home in 1943, and by the time Brown cast her as Velvet Brown opposite Mickey Rooney, she was 12 years old and had already learned things about film sets that most adults never learn at all. She understood continuity. She understood how to find her light without being told. What she had never learned, and perhaps never needed to learn, was to stop noticing the people around her. That particular professional detachment, the ability to move through a crowded soundstage while remaining essentially alone, never fully took hold in Elizabeth Taylor, not at 12, not at 40, not ever. It was, depending on who was describing it and when, either her greatest vulnerability or the source of everything genuinely extraordinary about her. The 9-year-old had been on set for 3 days by the time Elizabeth noticed him. His name does not appear prominently in the surviving production records, which is itself a kind of story about how the studio system worked. Child actors in supporting and background capacities were processed efficiently and largely invisibly, brought in when the script required them and released when it did not. He was not a difficult child. He was quiet, cooperative, and technically competent. He hit his marks. He took direction. He did not cause problems. And because he did not cause problems, the adults on Stage 27 had largely stopped seeing him. He had become part of the furniture of the production, present and accounted for and essentially invisible. Elizabeth saw him on his first morning and kept watching him across 3 days in a way that, according to people who were there and spoke about it much later, was unusual even for her. The crew noticed her watching him before they noticed anything about him, and most attributed it to simple friendliness, to the sociable quality that had already distinguished her on every set she had worked on. She liked people. This seemed like more of the same. It was not. What Elizabeth had seen was something in the quality of the boy's stillness between takes. Not the relaxed stillness of a child who is comfortable and at ease, but the particular contracted stillness of a child who has learned that the safest thing to do is take up as little space as possible. She recognized it because she had felt versions of it herself, had felt it on sets before she was old enough to understand what she was feeling, had understood long before she had the words for it that being a child in a professional adult environment meant performing a specific kind of acceptable smallness. The difference was that Elizabeth had eventually stopped performing it. She did not know yet why this boy had not. The moment itself happened on the afternoon of the 3rd day, during a reset between setups when the crew was repositioning equipment and most of the cast had drifted toward the edges of the stage to wait. The boy was sitting alone against the back wall, not reading, not talking to anyone, his whole body organized around a principle of minimum intrusion. Shoulders drawn in, elbows tucked, feet flat on the floor. Elizabeth walked toward him from across the stage, past the cameras, past 2 assistant directors who both noted later that they had watched her go without thinking to ask where she was headed, as if her trajectory had a self-evident rightness to it that made questioning it unnecessary. She simply crossed the stage and crouched down to the boy's eye level, and then she leaned in close, and she said something to him that nobody else on stage 27 could hear. The boy's face was visible to most of the crew from where they were standing. This is what they all agreed on. Years and decades later, his face was what they watched. Not Elizabeth, whose back was mostly to them, but the boy, whose expression in the 30 or 40 seconds that followed was the kind of thing that stops professional film people in their tracks. Something unlocked in his face. That was how most of them described it, something that had been held very carefully in position suddenly released, and the face that was left afterward was younger somehow, less defended, more genuinely present than anything they had seen from him in 3 days of shared professional proximity. One grip told a journalist in the 1980s that it was the most startling thing he had ever watched happen to a human face, and he had worked in Hollywood for 30 years by that point. Elizabeth stood up, smoothed her riding costume, and walked calmly back to her mark. The boy sat against the wall for another moment. Then he straightened his spine. The boy grew up. He continued working in the industry for a time, then moved into other things, and the years accumulated the way they do. He did not speak publicly about the incident on stage 27 for a very long time. When journalists and researchers eventually found their way to him, drawn there by the trail of secondhand accounts from crew members who had never quite gotten the image out of their heads, he was consistently gracious and consistently guarded in a way that was different from ordinary privacy. It was not that he did not want to talk about it. It was that he seemed to understand that the full weight of what had happened that afternoon was not fully transferable through language, that any account he gave would be a reduction of something that had operated below words. What he did say, in various forms across various conversations over the years, adds up to something coherent even if it resists simple summary. He had been afraid, not of anything specific on the set. The director was fair, the crew was professional, no one had been unkind to him, but of the set itself, of the enormous impersonal machinery of a major Hollywood production and his smallness inside it. He had been managing this fear for 3 days with the only tool he had, which was to make himself as inconspicuous as possible, to be so quiet and so minimally present that the fear had nothing to attach itself to. It was not working, but he did not know that yet. And then Elizabeth Taylor came across the stage and crouched down and said something to him so specific, so accurate, so exactly calibrated to the thing he had not told anyone, that the management collapsed. Not catastrophically, but gently, the way a fist unclenches when someone takes the thing it has been holding too tightly. She told him that the horses were afraid too. That the horses were enormous and powerful and had been working on film sets for years, and they were still afraid sometimes, and nobody thought less of them for it, and the fear did not stop them from being extraordinary. She had spent weeks with those horses before production began, learning their rhythms, earning their trust, understanding the specific logic of how a frightened animal holds itself, and what she had learned was that fear and capability were not opposites. They were companions. The horse that was afraid and moved anyway was not less impressive than a horse that felt nothing. It was more impressive because it was doing the harder thing. She told him she had been afraid on her first set, and her second, and probably her 10th, and that the trick was not to stop being afraid but to keep moving anyway, because the cameras could not see it unless you showed them. And then she said one more thing. The thing he was most reluctant to repeat, because it was the thing that had done the most work in him across 60 subsequent years. Which was that she could see he was going to be good at this, and she wanted him to know that, because someone had once told her the same thing on a day when she needed to hear it, and she had never forgotten it. What Elizabeth demonstrated on stage 27 was not simply sensitivity, it was something more specific, which was the ability to recognize a particular kind of invisible suffering and respond to it without making the sufferer feel exposed. This is a rare skill in adults. In a 12-year-old, it is almost inexplicable. The people who knew her during the National Velvet production consistently described the same quality, an attention to the people around her that was not performative and not intermittent but structural, built into the way she moved through the world. She noticed things specifically and accurately and without the self-protective distance that most people maintain as a matter of psychological survival. The cost of this over a lifetime was considerable. It meant she was permeable in ways that caused her real damage, unable to easily separate herself from the emotional weather of those around her. The gift of it was equally considerable, and the 9-year-old against the wall of stage 27 experienced it in its purest form. National Velvet was released in December of 1944 and made Elizabeth Taylor a genuine star, her face on magazine covers, her name above the title, the extraordinary violet eyes already becoming the visual shorthand that would follow her for the rest of her life. What endures most powerfully in that film? What made audiences in 1944 and still makes audiences feel what they feel when they watch it, is the absolute unguarded quality of her performance. The willingness to be genuinely present on screen in a way that even very skilled adult actors rarely manage. Across the decades that followed, across Giant and Suddenly Last Summer and Cleopatra and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and The Eight Marriages and the Academy Awards and the AIDS activism, the incident on stage 27 reads less like an isolated anecdote and more like a key to understanding everything. It illuminates something otherwise difficult to account for: how a person who lived so publicly and so turbulently, so often at the center of enormous scandal, also managed throughout that same life to be the person that people in genuine distress reached for. Rock Hudson called her when he was dying. Montgomery Clift, in the years of his long deterioration after the car accident that reshaped his face and his confidence, was most consistently cared for by Elizabeth. The patients and activists who worked alongside her in the early years of the AIDS crisis described her in terms that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with presence. She showed up, she sat with people, she looked at them directly, she was not afraid of them. This was not a developed skill. It was not the result of therapy or self-improvement. It was the same thing that had taken her across stage 27 when she was 12 years old, an orientation toward other people's hidden experience that was simply part of how she was built, that preceded any conscious intention and continued operating regardless of everything else happening in her life. The marriages could be falling apart. The productions could be in crisis. The press could be printing whatever it was printing on any given day. And Elizabeth Taylor would still be the one who noticed the 9-year-old against the wall. The surviving production documents from National Velvet are detailed and well preserved in the MGM archives. There are cost reports, shooting schedules, script revisions, costume inventories, daily call sheets going back to the first day of principal photography. There is documentation of almost everything that happened on that production, because MGM documented everything. It was a corporation of enormous scale running an enormously expensive operation, and corporations of that kind leave paper trails. What the paper trail does not contain is what happened in the unscheduled pause on stage 27 when Elizabeth Taylor walked off her mark and crossed the soundstage and crouched down beside a 9-year-old boy and told him something about horses and fear and cameras not being able to see what you do not show them. That moment exists only in the memories of the people who were there and in the way it propagated outward across time. In the boy who grew old carrying it, in the crew members who described it to journalists and biographers across the following decades, in the texture of everything Elizabeth Taylor did for the next 67 years, all of which was shaped by the same refusal to perform the professional detachment that everyone around her had mastered, the same insistence on actually seeing the people she found herself near. The cameras rolled again. The production moved forward. National Velvet was completed on schedule and went on to become one of the most beloved films of the decade. Elizabeth Taylor became Elizabeth Taylor. The boy against the wall straightened his spine and walked back to his mark and finished the day's work, and nobody watching him could have told that anything had changed. But something had changed, in the way that things change when someone sees you accurately at a moment when you needed to be seen, not dramatically, not with any visible evidence, but completely and permanently and without the possibility of going back. That was what Elizabeth Taylor whispered to the 9-year-old on stage 27, and that was what it did, and that was why the people who watched it never forgot it. Not because it was performed, not because it was calculated, but because it was true, and because it worked, and because in 60 years of watching human beings on film sets and in every other context the industry creates, most of them had never seen anything quite like it again. The boy against the wall had been invisible. Elizabeth Taylor had made him visible to himself. And the people who witnessed it understood, without being told, that they had just watched something that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with the kind of person Elizabeth Taylor actually was. Long before the fame, long before the violet eyes became the most recognized eyes in the world, long before any of the rest of it. She had always been this. The cameras had simply not caught it yet.